Turn to Daniel chapter 2. That's where we're going to start, but we're not going to be in there very long this morning. We're going to hit the last few verses of Daniel chapter 2. But maybe it's the teacher in me, but I always like to review what we've done in the past. And I think everybody's been here before. Except for Zane's brother. We're glad you're here too. The note sheets are being passed out. If you want one, feel free to take one. If you don't want one, that's okay. I am going to ask you to write something down today. So you may want to have a paper or a pen. If you don't have a pen, at least we'll give you a pen, or Angie will give you a pen. Somebody will give you a pen. But I'm going to do a quick review, and then we'll get to that in just a little bit. Yes. So first of all, in chapter 1, we talked about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they have been taken from their homes, and they're being in captivity, and they were indoctrinated probably for about 3 years in the Babylonian ways and in the Babylonian Empire. And after that 3-year period, our time frame, if you were taking notes, is going to be in 602 BC. Because of the historical records we have of King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, we pretty much know this date. It is pretty sure. So 602 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar now has a dream. And it's probably a dream that he doesn't remember. And he asks all of his wise men to tell him the dream and tell him the interpretation of the dream. Now at this time, Daniel has just finished his training. And so he's probably in kind of an apprentice stage. So he's not a wise man per se. He's moving in that direction, but he's not in the king's court. Well, none of those individuals that the king asked to tell him his dream and to interpret it are able to do that. And in chapter 2, verse 11, they even say themselves, it's impossible. You can't do this. Not even the only people who can answer this are, quote unquote, the gods. And sure enough, that's the truth. In verse 13 of Daniel chapter 2, we see that the king is so angry and so upset that he starts having the wise men killed. And when the captain of the guard goes to Daniel to kill him, presumably Daniel says, wait, what's going on? What's happening? And the captain of the guard explains it to him, and he says, can you ask for a little bit more time? And Daniel asks the king for a little bit of time. And immediately after asking for time, Daniel goes to his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And according to verse 17 and 18, the Bible doesn't say pray, but they're seeking the mercy of God, and they're reaching out to God, and they're praying to God. And then that night, God reveals to Daniel both the dream and the dream meaning. So Daniel now knows. Daniel then sends the message. If you remember, the first message was, stop killing everybody. Don't kill anybody else. And then he goes to the king. And he tells him the dream, and he tells him the meaning of the dream. And that's what we've been talking about the last few weeks. And at this point, we're going to pick up the story right here. We're eventually going to get to Esther, but it's just taking me a while because I like this stuff. I find this very interesting. So looking at Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 through 49. It says, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and he commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God, Daniel's God, is the God, the God of all the gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets. Since you could reveal this secret, this dream. Verse 48. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and a chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat, some versions say, at the gate of the king, but this New King James is also going to say at the king's court. at this passage for just a little bit and kind of look at what happens here, because if you look at verse 46, the most powerful man in the world at this time falls on his face, prostrates before Daniel. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine, and I don't want to get political, but can you imagine the President of the United States laying down flat, prostrate on the ground before anybody? Well, somebody are saying, yeah. Well, he shouldn't. But that's how the king, the Babylonian king, he's a great warrior. That's what he has been doing most of the years of his reign, and even when his father was reigning, he was fighting. He was a warrior, and he realizes there's something about Daniel. And he lays down before Daniel. And then he presents an offering and incense to Daniel. The things that you would normally do to a god, per se. That's what the king is doing to Daniel. And I know I have it in my notes here for a second, but I want to stop for just a second. How old is Daniel again? He was a teen in Daniel chapter 1 when he was taken into captivity. So everything that I read, he was probably anywhere from the ages of 12 to 18, maybe 19. He's just been through 3 years of indoctrination. So whatever age you think Daniel was when he was a teen or a young man taken into captivity, according to Daniel chapter 2, this is in, and we talked about this before, this would have been actually the 3rd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which would have coincided with 3 years of indoctrination or 3 years of training. So add 3 years. If Daniel was 18, he's 21 years old now. He's a young man. And the king is offering to him what you would offer to a god. The king is laying down before Daniel. And the king is saying in verse 47, there is no other God but your God. He is the Lord of kings. He knows everything. He knows what I was thinking when I was sleeping in my bed at night. And he realizes the power that our God has. And he humbles himself. And then, verse 48 says, Daniel is promoted. Daniel is made the ruler of the whole province of Babylon. Now, just to get this in our minds straight, Babylon it's the Babylonian Empire, and they have conquered pretty much the known world at this time. Not as large as the Greek and the Roman empires, but they've conquered a large area, all of this area of the Middle East, per se. And in that area, they would have had different provinces, or they would have had different states. Some of what I understood, and I couldn't get a definite answer, some say there would be maybe as few as 6 provinces in the Babylonian Empire, and some say as many as 180. So you choose the number in between. I didn't put that on here because I don't know. But whatever the province of Babylon encumbers, it's not the entire kingdom, but it's just the province of Babylon. He is now the ruler, or he's kind of made the governor of the province of Babylon. He is in charge. This would be the most important province in the kingdom, because that's where the capital is at. I would make the analogy of Washington, D.C., but that totally falls apart, because that's nothing. But he's made this, and he is made the chief administrator over all of the wise men of Babylon. So if I read Daniel chapter 2 correctly, Nebuchadnezzar gets so upset that these guys can't do what they said they can do. They can't tell him what he was thinking. They can't interpret his dream. that the wise men that are around him, when King Nebuchadnezzar gives the order to start killing these guys, well, the wise men that are there are probably the first ones to go. So the court of wise men is now deplete of at least some of them, because some of them were killed. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to make you essentially the governor of Babylon, and I'm going to make you in charge of what's left of the wise men and the men who are now going to be under your care. So Daniel is now over these guys, and we see that he is going to be in the court. And he's also given many great gifts. I don't know what Daniel's financial status was before this. I can assume it was virtually nothing. But Daniel now has prestige, and he has honor, and he has a place of importance, and he's a government official, and he's probably made a good bit of money from this situation, or wealth from this situation. But what's the first thing that Daniel does? Or what's the only thing that we see that Daniel does? Well, we don't know exactly what he does. This is where I was going to talk about his age. He's probably no more than 22 years old. So he's still, in my opinion, an extremely young man. The only thing we know about his reaction is what we read in verse 49. And what does he do in verse 49? He remembers his friends. When Daniel was at rock bottom, when Daniel didn't know what to do, when Daniel went to the king and said, give me some time, I'm going to find out this dream for you. He goes to 3 individuals. And he says, pray for me. Let's do this together. Let's pray together. Help me through this. And now that Daniel has received all of these things, the only thing we know for sure is that he goes to the king and he petitions the king and he says, I'm sure he says thank you, but he says thank you. Now I want to take my 3 buddies, my 3 people who've been with me the whole 3 years. Probably the only family he has now. And says, I want these 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I want them to be over the affairs of the province of Babylon. I'm the governor. I'm in charge of the province of Babylon, but I'm going to be sitting with the king. Somebody actually has to run the affairs of Babylon. And I want these 3 guys to do this. And he puts them in a place of honor and prestige. And they're probably not much older, or probably the same age as Daniel at this time. And this is where I want to get sidetracked, because I want us to look at something else. Remember 17, that's who he calls on to pray with. Let me ask you a question. When your life, I guess I should stay over here. When your life gets really tough, that's not a correct sentence. When things seem like they're falling apart, like they did for Daniel at the beginning of this chapter, who do you turn to? I'm sure you turn, all of us here, I would assume we turn to God. When things are going bad, when our life is difficult, when we're going to have issues that we're concerned about, we pray, we reach out to God. But who are the people that you turn to? Who do you reach out to? And by the same token, are you a friend that others can turn to for help and support in difficult times? Who do you reach out to? And can you be someone that other people reach out to? So I have a few questions. I want you to think about this. Even those of you who don't have blanks on your paper, I'd like for you to answer these questions for me. If you were unexpectedly promoted in your job, I'm assuming that's a good thing. All of a sudden your boss comes in and says, hey, you're going to move you up and you're going to be whatever. Or maybe you came into a large sum of money. Maybe that long lost uncle you thought you had that was super rich and wealthy decides to give you all the money. Who Who do you tell? Who do you celebrate with? Any good news that you have received, who do you reach out to? Who do you share your good fortune with? I was going to say, if you're a young person, you probably just post it on Instagram or Facebook. That's not the same. That's not what I'm trying to reach here for you. But who do you call first when something good happens to you? By the same token, if you received bad news, or you needed prayers for a situation in your life, or you just needed someone to listen to you, who do you reach out to? I don't know how many people we're talking about, but I put 3 blanks on that paper. And if you feel like it, you can. If you, I'm not going to go check. It's not homework. You don't have to stay here till you finish the homework or whatever. But I want you to write their names down on those little blanks. Good or bad, who would be the 3 people that you reach out to? Who do you call first? It's a rhetorical question, but thank you for raising your hand. Now, there was a post that I read a little while back. And the title of the story, the post or whatever, is how many friends can you really have? And I'm going to get my pointer. I'm going to get my teacher too out of here again. Yeah, exactly, right? Now you got to behave. So what this idea is saying is, for best friends, you probably have 1 or 2 or 3 dearest friends. That's why I put 3 blanks there. 3 individuals that are just there, or 1, or maybe 2. That is the person that you can confide in, the person you can talk to, this person you want to reach out to when you find out something really good or really bad. Who's that first person that you call? And then, this gentleman, Rich, breaks it down to it. He says, then we have a group of special friends. These are 3 to 5 close friends outside of your inner circle. So you may have 1 or 2 or 3 here, and then you may have a few more that would be considered your special friends. And then, probably 7 to 12 people who you spend time with on a regular basis. Those are your social friends. Who do you go to dinner with? Who do you hang out with? The people that you would spend time with. Those are your social friends. And that would be kind of here. Then you have what he refers to as casual friends. Depending on who you are and maybe where you work, you have 50 to 200 people that you know. You know them by name, and you might socialize with them, or you see them at work, or you spend a little time with them. You could maybe call them acquaintances, people that you know, that you care about, but they're not. You wouldn't spend a lot of time with them. You wouldn't call them a special friend. You wouldn't call them your best friend. And then everybody else outside of this are people you really don't know. And he says this because then he makes an analogy. 2 things that he points out in this article, which I thought was very interesting. Number 1 is a true, dear, closest friend. Somebody who is the person you can really go to. You're not going to have more than 3. You might, but it's hard. It's hard to be that friend to a lot of people because it takes time, it takes effort, it takes work. And we can't be that type of friend to everyone. It's physically impossible. And then he goes on to say, Jesus had an inner circle of friends. Peter, James, and John. And we read about these 3 guys repeatedly, that certain special things that Jesus does, he calls in Peter, James, and John. And that's almost like his inner circle of individuals that he confides in the most, that he trusts the most, maybe that he expects the most out of. But he has 12. He has a larger group. We know more about Andrew and Matthew and Thomas. That the Gospels tell us a little bit more about these guys, and maybe those are the second group of friends that he has. But Jesus has a full 12. He has all 12 apostles. Those who spent more than 2 years with him pretty much on a daily basis. And I want to jump back for a second. Because if we go with this notion that Jesus' closest friends were Peter, James, and John, we know about Peter. We talked about Peter opening the keys to the kingdom. We talked about Peter and his sermon to the Jews and his sermon to the Gentiles, and how Peter spreads the gospel and becomes a leader in the church in Jerusalem, and eventually is martyred. History tells us he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be killed like Jesus. And then we know about John, the last apostle to lived a long time. Jesus told John to take care of his mother when he was on the cross. John is sent to Ephesus, and then he's sent to the Isle of Patmos, writes the book of Revelation for us, and probably dies a normal, natural cause of death. But what happened to Jesus' third, quote-unquote, best friend? He's the first one to get killed. He's the first one. And you might look at that and say, well, Jesus, these are your 3 best friends. Why would you allow James to be killed so early in the gospel? And I say that, and I'm just saying me, because sometimes I get into this trap of saying, well, I'm a good Christian. I try to do what's right. I try to do the best things I can. Why are bad things happening to me? Because that's life. Because that's what happens. And Jesus is not going to intercede in every little thing like that. If God will allow his own son to die, and if he will allow James, one of his closest friends, to be the first one martyred, maybe he just wanted to bring James home sooner. Who knows? But we don't understand those things. John 15:15. Don't go there, because I'm taking this out of context, and we're going to expand it as we progress on. Jesus is telling his apostles, you were my servants, but now I have called you my friends. He's telling them, you are my friends. We're going to look at that in a little bit. I want to look at a number of passages here on friendship. Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12 says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. And threefold cord is not quickly broken. I think this message in Ecclesiastes is the same message that God says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. Genesis 2 is specifically talking about man and providing him a helpmate in a woman. But the concept is the same. It's not good for man to be alone. God never intended us to go through this life alone, to be by ourselves. And I fear nowadays, even though with so much, with the ability to communicate with others at our fingertips, literally, everything that I understand is saying people are feeling more and more alone than they ever have before. And God never intended it to be that way. In Genesis 2, it's talking about a husband and a wife. But sometimes things happen and we lose that husband or we lose that wife. And I think Ecclesiastes is talking about that friendship. Who do we turn to? Who are we with? Who's our companion that lifts us up when we fall? Who's that one that takes care of us when danger arises? And then he goes on to say, 2 is really good, but 3 is even better. Don't go through this life alone, struggling to feel like you have to do everything by yourself. Because God is saying, I provided friendships for you. Other passages about this in Proverbs 13, verse 20. Be with wise men and become wise. Be with fools and you'll suffer harm. Choose your friends wisely. There's other passages I could have also gone with this, but I'm trying to stay on the positive side here, because if we want to be wise, if we want to be smart, if we want to be educated, if we want to learn, if we want to know things, then hang out with people who are of the same mind. Proverbs 27:17. These are not all King James. Normally I put all King James. But I like the way the New Living Translation says Proverbs 27:17. I could have just copied Petey's shirt. I think he was wearing it the other day. As iron sharpens iron, and I chose this one, so a friend sharpens a friend. We make each other better. 27:9. Perfume and incense bring joy to the heart, and the pleasantries of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. Proverbs 18:24. There are quote-unquote friends who destroy each other. We all know those. But a real friend sticks closer to you than a brother. Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. I'm going to have to confess something here. You can go to it later if you want to. When I was looking through this, I was sitting here, and I think I had the lights off. I don't know why. It was Tuesday. And on my notes, I wrote down the passage, Proverbs 17:27. And I didn't think about it. So when I think it was Friday, I was copying and pasting stuff from the Bible, and I took Proverbs 17:27, and I put it in here, and I thought, wait a second. Proverbs 17:27, I don't know, I can't quote it exactly, says, basically, don't worry, your goats will have plenty of milk to take care of your family and to meet the desires of your daughters. And I'm like, well, how did that come into play? Maybe I need to go buy goats so I can have milk to pay for their daughters as they grow up. I don't know. I just thought that was weird. It's a very weird passage. Anyway, that's a side note. But anyway, those passages talk about friendship. The New Testament talks about friendship in Hebrews chapter 12, 24 through 25. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. The day is the day when Jesus is going to come back. But what he's saying is, we use this passage a lot to say, you better come to church. But what he's saying is, why? Why do we come together? Why do we need to be with each other? Why did God establish His church in the first place? So that we can encourage one another. Because life can get difficult. Because bad things happen in our lives. And we need to stir up one another to love and to good works. We need to be there for one another. Romans chapter 12 verse 10 says, Paul is telling them, love one another with brotherly affection. And then he says, outdo one another in showing honor. Basically, what I see here is if you want to have friends, you've got to be a friend to other people. You have to be what you want others to be. Here's a little bit more of that passage in John. John 15:15. Jesus says, no longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But now I have called you friends. For all things that I heard from my Father, I have made known to you. When you have a true friend, do you share with them what's in your heart, what's on your mind, what's in your soul, what your hopes, what your dreams, what your feelings are? That's what Jesus is saying. I've shared everything with you guys. I'm going to expand on that a little bit more, but I need to hurry. So now I want you to go back for a second. Go back to if you wrote names down, if you didn't write names down, go back to the individuals you would say. The individuals that you would consider your best friends. Do you have anybody? Do you have somebody that you consider to be your best friend? By the way, you can put your spouse as your best friend. If you don't have people who you consider that you can confide in, if you don't have people that you can reach out to in trouble, if you don't have people that you would talk to when good things happen to you because you're afraid, oh, they're just going to think I'm bragging, or they're just going to think bad of me, or they're just going to try to pull me down. If that's the case, Proverbs 18:24, a man who has friends must himself be friendly. If we want to have those type of friends, we have to be that type of friend. If we want to be a true friend, then we have to be a true friend to other people. Number 2, how much do you care about the salvation of your friend or friends? I should have put that. Look at the names of the people you wrote in that paper, or the people you would consider your best friends. How much do you care about their salvation? And what are you doing to help ensure that they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior? And if that person is a Christian, what are you doing to help them to grow as a Christian? Because we can quote the passage about iron sharpening iron, but if I'm not helping my friends be better Christians, then I'm not helping sharpen them. The 3 individuals that you wrote on your paper, do you pray with them? Do you get together and pray with that person? Do you pray for that person? Look at the names of the 3 people you wrote. How often do you pray for them? By name. How often do you say, dear God, please be with Myra today as she does X, Y, and Z? How often do you do that? How often do you pray for that person's spiritual well-being? I take the list that we give us and the names that are added on there, and I try to pray for everybody on there by name. But one thing I'm not real good at, I started to do it a little bit. I think I mentioned I used to walk around in here. I get my steps, and I would walk around and I would remember people's names, and I would pray for individuals' spiritual well-being. But I kind of got away from that. But how often do we pray? And I'm talking, right now I'm just talking about the 3 people you wrote, or the 1 person you wrote, or the 2 people you wrote. How often do you pray for that person's spiritual well-being? It's great for me to pray for Myra to do things well at what she's doing, or things that are happening with her in her health or with her family. It's great for me to pray for those things. But how often do I pray for her spiritual well-being? Because if I'm concerned about her salvation, then I need to be praying about her spiritual well-being as well. Because our spiritual is more important than our physical. And our prayer time should focus more on the spiritual than the physical. Even though we know that God uses the physical to help bring people to Him spiritually. And finally, would Jesus consider you His friend? I asked, I didn't know who was going to sing this one, lead singing, but I asked Rusty to lead What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And I've gone way too long. I thought this was going to be a short one. Look at the words to the song. 7:30. Would Jesus consider you his friend? When push comes to shove, would Jesus consider you his friend? Are you a friend to Jesus, and is Jesus your friend? And I say that because I'm going to close with this. Now, I told you before, you're my friends. And then I read a little more, but I'm going to read you the whole passage now. John chapter 15, 11 through 17. This is Jesus speaking. These things I have spoken to you. Why? Why have you told us all of these things? Jesus says, so that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. When we are a friend of Jesus, we have a joy that no one can take away. Verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Because greater love has no man than this, that he laid down one's life for his friends. That's what Jesus is going to do. Then he says, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. If you want to be considered a friend of Jesus and you want to have a relationship that song says that we can have, then we have to do what Jesus tells us to do. Now we get to the verse that I was quoting. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant doesn't know what his master is doing, but I've called you friends, for all the things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. I have made known to you the plan of salvation, the opportunity to accept God's mercy and his grace, to be adopted into his family, to be a part of the called out. I've done all of that because I care about you, because I love you, and because you're my friends. And if we have friends, that's what we're going to do for them. Verse 16 says, you didn't choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give you. If we have that relationship with God, if we're true friends with God, and we're trying to bear that fruit, and we're trying to do what God wants us to do, then he says, whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give you. I don't think that means if you ask to win the lottery this week, you're going to win the lottery. I don't think that means if you want a brand new car, that Bert Ogden is going to drive down here and just present you a new car. But I think what that means is if I'm praying for Myra and her physical well-being, that God is going to work in her life. If I'm praying for Myra and her spiritual well-being, that God is going to work in her life. If I'm praying for myself all the time, God can do whatever he wants to do. But if I'm praying for others all the time, I'm going to see God working in the life of others more often. Because Jesus concludes this by saying, the things I've commanded you, that you love one another. Our prayers shouldn't be selfish prayers. Our ambitions shouldn't be selfish ambitions. Our ambition should be like Daniel's was. When good things happened to Daniel, he brought along his buddies with him. So if you do win the lottery, don't forget the rest of us. Just kidding. I say all of this to say this. I don't know what your relationship is with God. I don't know if you consider God your friend. I don't know if you have that type of relationship. But I would hope that you have that type of relationship with some individuals in this world. And that you have people that you can trust, that you care about, that you can reach out to. Because God wants us to have people that we can rely on when life brings us down. And if there's anything we can do to help you as you journey through this life, good or bad, then come forward as we stand and